This is me, Brett Lonsdale from Lightning Tools. I've specialized in business connectivity services, and before that, the Business Data Catalog, since it was launched back in 2007. I co-authored the Business Connectivity Services book, which is so if you want a copy of that book signed by all three authors, then get down to booth 17, and we'll be giving that away. And a couple of other bits to know about me. I'm the co-host of the SharePoint Pod Show. I don't know if anybody listens to that. It's called the SharePointPodShow.com, and we do lots of interviews with other SharePoint MVPs and Microsoft employees on their sort of area of specialism. So there's about 70 different episodes on there with some great content that you can go and have a listen to. And all four people are here. So there's myself, Rob Foster, Nick Swan, and also Jeremy Thake with the four people that do all the interviews. So everybody's here at the conference this week. Okay, so what are we going to talk about? Well, first of all, how many people have already got a good handle on what Business Connectivity Services is, even in a previous version or anything? Okay, there's a few. Okay, so what I was going to do is just do a high-level overview of Business Connectivity Services, so we understand everybody's on the same page as to what it is. And if you do know BCS, then there might be a few things that you pick up from that. We'll then have a look at the business problems that can be overcome with Business Connectivity Services. Who needs to also be involved in setting BCS up? So it's not just SharePoint administrators, it's not just developers and so on. There's quite a handful of people that usually have to be involved in building the solution so that you can view your company's data through SharePoint. And then, fingers crossed, we'll be doing lots of demos, laptop permitting. So we'll be exploring the SharePoint external list. Those of you who raised your hands, so have you got experience of 2010 Business Connectivity Services or 2007? Anybody? 2010? Okay. So yeah, the external list was introduced in SharePoint 2010. It's been slightly enhanced in 2013. Okay, we better switch. We able to? Do I just hit a button on here to switch to the other? Which one is it? Okay. This mouse, yeah. Okay, that's cool. Don't worry, I can work with this. It's fine. Okay, so yeah, the external list, it's been somewhat enhanced in 2013. Thank you. So we'll be going through what those enhancements are. The web parts, there's kind of good and bad news about the web parts, which I'll talk to you about. One of them is really about customizing those web parts. We used to use SharePoint Designer a lot to do that, and we could still do that, but it's a lot more work than it used to be in SharePoint 2010. The business data column, we'll be exploring that. So this is a field type inside SharePoint lists and libraries that we can add and get to our external data, no matter where that's coming from. So if we're creating documents inside a document library, such as a proposal for a customer or something like that, we can store metadata in that document. So rather than, let's say we're creating a proposal for BP as a customer, instead of typing in BP or British Petroleum and getting this inconsistency when people have created the documents, we'll be able to look up that external data from maybe Dynamic CRM or whatever we're connected to. We'll also take a look at the Office client. So throughout Microsoft Office 2013, there's lots of things that you can do, lots of things that you might not have been aware that you can do. So Outlook is one of the main things. You can use Microsoft Outlook to bring data from an external list into Outlook. So it could be contacts or something like that. If, let's say you're connected to your Dynamic CRM system. If you want all of those people in your Dynamic CRM system, all of your customers, inside Outlook, so it's available offline, you can do that as long as you've set the Office type when you create your external content type. So we'll be talking about how we can go and do that. The external content types we'll explore. How do we go about creating them? So there's two tools. We can use SharePoint Designer or we can use Visual Studio. And there's a brand new supported data type that we can connect to now as well. So back in 2010, you can use SharePoint Designer 2010 to connect to a SQL Server directly or a WCF web service or a .NET assembly. And the latter two, the .NET Assembly and the WCF Web Service, you'd have to create and write the code for in Visual Studio. So that was quite, obviously, a lot of hard work. In 2013, it now supports OData. So how many people have done anything with OData at all? So if you imagine the business problem is that we've got lots of different silos of data. So it might be that we've got a dynamic CRM system, we've got maybe Sage or something like that, or SAP, whatever it is. We can bring all of that data together into SharePoint. And that's what Business Connectivity Services is all about. But sometimes getting to that data is a problem. Might be because you haven't got the skills in-house to write the code to connect to the data source. So SAP is one of those ones that's actually quite a challenge. Because you have to do a lot of work with SAP in order to bring that into SharePoint. But one thing we can do now is publish these data sources as OData. So it's a uniformed API that allows us, data API that allows us to go and connect more easily. So similar to connecting via a web service and bringing data, we'll be connecting via the URL, and that URL is our endpoint to then get at that data source. So if you had an Oracle database or SAP, you can publish it up as OData and then connect to it, and that gets over your networking challenges as well, because it might be that your SAP server is in another country or something, and you've got firewalls to go through and that kind of thing. So you'll be able to still connect to it. So Visual Studio actually allows you to connect to an OData data source without having to write code, which is good. So just go into Visual Studio, create a new app, and connect to an OData source, and it will generate the external content type for you. So you don't need to write any code in order to do that. And something else I just mentioned then is you create it as an app. So you actually end up with an external list created as an app that you can then deploy to a site, wherever you want to use that. And that means that you're not having to package this external content type up and deploy it as a farm solution, which is what we had to do in SharePoint 2010. Okay. Service application, there's not many changes there, but we'll just talk briefly about it. Obviously, there is changes if you've gone from Business Data Catalog to Business Connectivity Services. And then on the right-hand side here, we've got the what is new. So the OData. We've also got these things called event listeners now. So you may have experienced the problem of having an external list with your data in 2010, but SharePoint is unaware of changes to the data. So let's say we're displaying some products information inside an external list, and we want to be able to get notified or fire off a workflow or something like that when that data changes. That's great with internal list. So if we're using a task list or a document library or something, if somebody goes and changes the content, we can have all sorts of things going on. We can have an event listener there, so people get notified that the document's changed or whatever, or somebody's checked the document out. We can also fire off a workflow when a new document gets created or somebody's changed that document. We couldn't do all of that with the external list in SharePoint 2010 because the data didn't actually reside in the list itself. So SharePoint was unaware via its own API and its own content database that change has actually taken place. So it's not an easy thing to do, but the API is there for us to write the code to trap events now. So you can have data changing. Let's say somebody changes a customer in the dynamic CRM system, that could now fire off a workflow inside your external list, and SharePoint could do something with that change. Okay, so that's a new thing that's come to 2013, along with the fact that you can now deploy these things as an app as well. Okay, so high-level view of business connectivity services. So it's all about accessing external data in SharePoint, we know that. We've got up here some of the different services that it provides us with. So the SharePoint server side, we've got the web parts. There's a whole suite of web parts. We've got a business data list web part, a business data related list web part, a business data item web part, and so on. These haven't really changed. Okay, But those suites of web parts, you can build pretty cool looking dashboards. Was anybody on my session yesterday? You were, okay. So in my session yesterday, we had a look at SharePoint 2010 and building a business data dashboard using business connectivity services. So there's all sorts of things you can do with KPIs and building charts and things like that using these web parts. You don't have to use them as they are, which is just a grid of information. You can take them into SharePoint Designer and tweak with them as much as you like, and that's going to lead on to some bad news in a moment. Okay, so the web parts are there. We've also got the search, so no matter what flavor of search you use, you can search the external data as well. So you can build a content source that points to the line of business data system, and that allows you to perhaps search on a customer or search on a product, just like you're searching on SharePoint content. And there's no reason for the SharePoint business user to think anything different as to where that content's coming from. They don't need to know that it's coming from SAP or whatever it is. They can just search on a keyword and they'll see the search results. They can click on the result and it will open up a profile page with a business data item on it showing all of the values from that search result. Okay. There are some big improvements to search itself, which means the indexing is far more powerful now. So that's indexing all of the time. And the refinements are much more powerful also. So you can refine a search more easily to get to the right content coming from your back-end system. The object model, there's been improvements there. So you get offered a lot of things out of the box with business connectivity services, the web parts that we've mentioned, the business data field type, etc. But there's always something that your organization wants you to do that BCS can't do out the box. And that might be that you've got a list of customers and we want to show them in a map instead of a grid of information. So we want to see where those customers are in the world, that sort of thing. So you can access the object model. There's a server-side object model and there's a client-side object model. So you can write the code to do whatever you want with those web parts. Now you might say at that point, well, why wouldn't I write the code anyway to just go and connect directly to the data source? We can do some link or ADO.NET or whatever it is to connect to the data anyway. But all the hard work has been done for you already with business connectivity services. You can access the data within just a few lines of code, okay, and start displaying it. So it's quite straightforward. All of your filters and everything that are there ready to just be called. User profiles. So obviously SharePoint 2013 has seen a lot of changes as far as becoming more social and so on. So even more important to make sure that your user profiles are all up to date, and people don't like updating their user profiles all that much inside SharePoint. They're too busy doing it in Facebook instead. But what we can do is use the BCS to go and connect to one of those databases that already has all of that information in it. Okay, so if you've got a HR database or something like that that's already got your skills and your resume in it, then we can pull that information in via BCS. And of course, we mentioned the external list as well. Okay, so on the client side, we talked about Outlook. So Microsoft Outlook being a tool that people use all day long. So you can, when you create your external content type, which contains the methods that expose the data, we can set what's known as the office type property. And there's 4 different types that you can set. So posts, contacts, tasks, and events. So if your data contains perhaps a start date and a due date and or a duration or something like that, you can map those properties to all of the office properties so that when you pull it into Outlook, it's now displaying in your task pane in Microsoft Outlook, even though that data might be in an external system. So think of your salespeople creating their scheduled calls, that kind of thing, inside the dynamic CRM system. This can all show inside Outlook via BCS. And likewise with contacts and whatnot. Excel is a new one. So Excel wasn't supported in SharePoint 2010 for business connectivity services. You could write your own code to bring the data in. There was Visual Studio tools for Office that would allow you to do that, so you'd have to write the code yourself in Visual Studio. But now if you go inside an external list, you can click a button, and that button pulls whatever data is inside the external list into Excel, and it's a one-way sync. So as the data changes in the back-end system, it's going to change inside your spreadsheet as well. So Excel actually uses the client runtime to maintain its own connection to the external data source. So that works independently just from your laptop or whatever you're using as a device. Access as well supports BCS. So within Microsoft Access, you can create almost linked tables, but rather than linking directly again to the database, you're going via business connectivity services. All you do there is you take your external content type, export it out, and then import it into Access. And it'll link all the tables in for you so that now you can start doing queries, building forms, reports, that sort of thing, which is quite good. Visio can also be used with BCS. So if you wanted to use the gauges and that sort of thing that you've got to hand in BCS, you can do that based upon your data. And the nice thing is you can also publish that back to SharePoint via the Visio Web Access. So then you can have the web parts showing your gauges on a dashboard or something like that, which is based on your data in the backend system. Word offers quick parts, and InfoPath also has a control that you can add on a form. So when people are completing their form, let's say they're filling out a form to request some vacation time or holiday time, they can fill that out and look up things like their line manager and locations and things like that using BCS controls. So that's pretty much the services that we get with BCS. It provides a BDC runtime. That's not a typo. BDC is Business Data Connectivity, not Business Data Catalog that it used to be. There's different ways of authenticating with the external data source. So one of the preferred ways is to use the secure store. The reason why that's one of the preferred ways is because when you're actually authenticating, a lot of people go for the easy option, and that is to use Windows authentication. But then you start getting into things like double hop issues and so on, which can be a pain. So you can configure the secure store to get past the double hop issue, but also then you're making sure that your users are accessing the data as them, and therefore their permissions are being honored on the actual backend database. Some people will enable this via PowerShell, the revert to self, to get around the double hop issue. That's not such a good idea. Your DBAs won't like you too much because now everybody in the organization, when they go onto their SharePoint team sites and looking at some business data web parts, they'll all be accessing that data as the same user. So they lose all of the auditing trail, and also you might be accessing content that you actually shouldn't be able to access. Okay. Connectors. So these are the connectors that we can connect to data sources. So a direct connector for Microsoft SQL. We've also got a WCF web service. So lots of data sources already publish their data as WCF web services, so we can call them, create an external content type, and then be able to access that data inside SharePoint. The .NET assembly is a compiled DLL that you would need to go in and create yourself using Visual Studio. So you can create an external content type with inside Visual Studio, generate all of your methods and everything, and then compile it as a DLL. That DLL can then be connected to via SharePoint Designer. So you've now got a packaged external content type that you can deploy to SharePoint. And then the new one, of course, is OData. Okay, so business problems resolved by business connectivity services. Basically what we're looking at here is lots of different silos of data that I mentioned. So SharePoint is a great tool to be able to bring all of that information together. It also cuts down on lots of things like training. So that's one big issue. If you take a complicated solution like SAP, you need to train all of your users up on how to use SAP, which is quite a big task if they don't use it every day. So if you just want to get a report of how well is your business doing, how much profit did we generate, that sort of thing, those financial guys in our organization might not need to know SAP. They can just pull that information out of a dashboard or something like that inside of SharePoint, which makes your life a lot easier. So who's involved in configuring all of this? Well, we mentioned SharePoint administrators earlier on. So one of the things that the SharePoint admin has to do is to obviously maintain the service application. So they need to make sure that the service application and the service application proxy are running on the SharePoint box. And through the service application properties, you can go and configure all of the the security as well for each external content type. So within there, there's permissions that you can assign to each SharePoint user. So even if we are using that revert to self option that we mentioned earlier on, where everybody is accessing the data as the same user, you can still trim the security based upon their SharePoint user account. So when Fred logs in, he might not have execute permissions on an external content type, which means that he's going to get the access denied displayed inside the web part when he tries to view some confidential information. So that's, again, something that the admins will do. Configuring the search as well. This isn't something that just works out the box. You don't just deploy an external content type to SharePoint and expect it to work. You have to create a content source, and optionally you can create a custom search page as well, so that you can get the results displayed in a nice manner and so on, and use a different search scope. So really what I'm describing here is roles, I guess. So all of these could be the same person, but these are the different roles. Database administrators as well inside an organization need to be involved in this. So the DBAs obviously need to grant permissions. I told a story to some of our staff last night that Christina Wheeler, who should have been doing this session right now, I met her in some town just south of New York, working on this consultancy gig for a week, and we were asked to come in and configure some connections to their external data source. But politics got involved, and Christina and I were there for 4 days just twiddling our thumbs because we weren't given permissions to the database that we were to use to build this solution. So there we were, charging every day we were there and having our hotels and everything paid for by the customer, and they were still arguing about whether they wanted to give us read access or not to the external data source. So on the Friday we got it, and then we were able to do our job. So we need the DBA on our side to be able to give us permissions to that data source as well. So SharePoint developers. I use the term developers fairly loosely because you're not really writing any code unless you're building the .NET assembly yourself. So you can use SharePoint Designer to create an external content type without having to write any code at all if you're going to connect to something like SQL, which is nice. And again, although you need Visual Studio, you can connect to an OData data source without writing any code either. And then finally, we've got the SharePoint Information Worker. So they also need to understand what data sources are available, what external content types have we got, how do we then go and access the right data by configuring the web parts and building our dashboards and so on. Now, these developers, when they connect to these external data sources and create the external content type, they like to use all the default naming. So you see lots of external content types called things like dbo.crm, whatever, and it doesn't mean anything to the information worker. So they can work a little bit with the information workers by making this information more understandable by using proper naming conventions. So maybe something like dynamic CRM customers would mean a lot more to you than the actual name of the table that we're accessing. Okay. So external lists, just like an internal list, but with external data. So the data itself does not live inside the list. It doesn't live inside the content database. It's a direct link coming from the external data source. But you get all of the options that you're used to having in a standard SharePoint list. There are still some things that you cannot do. So item level permissions is a good example. So inside a SharePoint list, such as a task list or an announcements list or a document library, you could set some item level permissions and say who's actually allowed to see that item. You can create the datasheet view and things like that, which is something that's not supported inside an external list as well. Okay. I showed a trick yesterday about how you can customize the forms used to input and edit the data. So one of the things that you get inside a standard SharePoint list is the Customize Form button, and you go to click that and it opens up inside InfoPath and it allows you to design the form that you're going to use to input new list items. With the external list, that option doesn't show, and if you go via the list settings, there's a form settings link, and if you click that, it says the external list does not support the use with InfoPath. But instead, you can go into SharePoint Designer just as a stepping stone to be able to click the Customize Form button on the external list, and that will then fire up InfoPath and you can design your form and everything. So you're not using SharePoint Designer to do it, you're just using SharePoint Designer to click the button that allows you to do it. So that's something that you can do still with the external list. So as I mentioned, this is new. So when you go inside the external list, you will be able to export now to Excel. So that maintains its one-way sync. It's a little bit disappointing, actually. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. I've given it that much thought. But when SharePoint 2013 first came out and the sort of first bits under the TAP program, it was a two-way sync. So you could then modify the data in Excel and it would write back to SharePoint via the external list, right the way back to the external data source. But I guess that could have been a bit dangerous if you let all the users loose on the external data, so they changed it to be just a one-way link. Okay, so yeah, the other improvement, of course, is the event listener. The web parts, these are read-only web parts. So the external list is the only way that you get the CRUD functionality, so being able to create, update, delete, etc. They are ideal for building business data dashboards. You've got web part connections, so you can take a business data list web part, connect it to a business data related list web part, even connect it to a business data item web part. So you can start drilling around the data and so on. You could customize these to a certain extent in two ways. You can edit the web part and that gives you an edit view link inside the web part. So if you edit the view, you can choose which columns you want to show, you can apply filters, you can apply sorting, that kind of idea. The downside is you can't do any other type of formatting. So if we take, for example, we've got some costs here. So what's a currency column inside the backend database will just come across as a number for some reason to 4 decimal places inside SharePoint. It's not formatted, it doesn't show as the currency symbol or anything like that. So we're certainly going to want to go and change that kind of thing. Now in SharePoint 2010, that was nice and easy. We'd modified the page in SharePoint Designer, and don't worry, we're not going to actually modify the page at all, it's just the web part. So if we used to use the term unghost and ghost. It's an Evolutions conference. So back in 2003, we had ghosted sites and unghosted sites and so on if you modified them in front page. So kind of the same thing goes on. If you modify a site in SharePoint Designer, it detaches it from the site definition. So that means you're not going to receive updates and things like that when SharePoint gets upgraded. But we're not doing any of that, we're just modifying the web part itself, so nothing to do with the site definition and the site itself. Okay. So in there, we'd be able to take the cell, apply the formatting that we want, just using a couple of clicks. We could do some conditional formatting on here if we wanted to. We can remove columns, we can add columns together, do some aggregate functions, that sort of idea, even do some grouping and so on. If you try to do that today, in 2013, the first thing you'll probably notice is there is no design tab. So you get the code view, there is no split view, and there is no design view that we used to have in SharePoint Designer 2010. So you can still do it all. You can still do all of this formatting and everything. It's just a lot harder work. But if you go to edit the web part itself, this is essentially a data view web part. The business data list and the related list, they're both data view web parts. So you can simply go into the web part properties and there's the XSLT button. So you can click that XSLT button, find the unit price column, whatever it is, and then apply the formatting in there. So it means you need to learn some XSLT. You can do the same thing in SharePoint Designer. Again, you have to use XSLT and there is no preview or anything like that. But if you opened up the page inside SharePoint Designer, you can jump to that line of code, modify the formatting options, but you'd have to save the page and then go into SharePoint refresh to be able to see what your change looks like. So that's the downside of all of this. Okay. So the business data column, as I mentioned, this is one of the field types that you can go in and create inside any SharePoint list or library. So we can, in the same way that we can create a single line of text or multiple lines of text, that sort of thing, we've got this external data option. So how many people make use of managed metadata? Okay, a few. All right, so one of the nice things about managed metadata is you can access your term store and go and grab terms from the term store, and that gives you some consistency in the way that you're using terms as metadata inside your libraries and your lists. And really this does the same thing, but rather than maintaining a term store, you're looking at from actual data in the back-end system. So like I say, we create a document inside a document library or create a task inside a task list, and we might want to complete a column of information, and rather than type it in a single line of text column, then we can just look that up from a dialog box. Okay. There are some issues that I would have loved to have been resolved here that haven't been in 2013. Anybody guess what the restrictions are or know what the restrictions are with this column? Anybody tried to create one of these as a site column in a content type? No, you can't. Okay. There is no option for the external data when you're creating a site column. So that's been around since SharePoint 2007. You couldn't create it in a content type, which is a big shame. So you have a document library with all these different columns that you want to use, but you have to actually create it in the document library itself or in the list itself. So if you want to reuse that, the only way of doing it is like what we used to do in SharePoint 2003, and that is save the list or library as a template. And then you go and deploy that template wherever you want to use it. So unfortunately, that's not been resolved. That issue is still there. But what we do is we basically choose the external data. Here we can specify the external content type that we want to use that contains our data. And then we can choose the column that we want to display. To store the data. So if we wanted to store, say, the company name rather than the customer ID, then we can do that. And then you can choose other columns that you want to display. So you could store, say, the company name as metadata within your document, but then display the address or the contact name or whatever else it is in the view of the library. So that gives you lots of abilities to then build views, do filtering, sorting, that sort of thing, so you get a nice way to organize all of your content inside that library. Go ahead. Yep.
And then phone number, address. You can do
On any of the columns, yep. Yeah, absolutely. The one thing that is sometimes misleading, and depending on the type of data you're connecting to, this is sometimes a good thing, sometimes a bad thing. It's a little bit like referential integrity. You know, when you're building a database and you want to enforce referential integrity, so if I delete a customer, do I want it to also delete the orders for that customer? Or do I want those orders to remain and still allow me to delete the customer? There's different scenarios where both work well. So when you go to store some metadata using this external data column, it does actually store that data. It's not linked like the external list. So if the data changes in your back-end system, it doesn't change inside your library. Okay? That could be a good thing, possibly, in some scenarios. But other scenarios, it's a bad thing. That hasn't improved much either. I say much, there is a workaround now. What you get is there's a little refresh indicator in the column that's storing the value. If you click that, it will actually go and update every single document back to the data source. Okay? If you've got 10,000 or 100,000 documents inside that library, that is going to be a huge job, and it slows SharePoint down immensely, going and getting all of that data and updating it again. So that's one area where you can take advantage of this new event listener with a bit of code. So as the data changes in the back-end system, you can use the Business Connectivity Services API to trap that event and then go and update that one item. Okay? So you do have to write code to do it, but you couldn't have written the code to do it in 2010, if that makes sense. So you have got that ability now, which is quite useful. It's via this that you also get a lot of the Office options as well. So in Word, there's this thing called a quick part where you can access the document properties. Has anybody used them? Yep. So let's say we're creating a Word document that is going to be our proposal that we're going to send out to customers. On the page itself, on your document, you can insert quick parts, which are basically the columns coming from your library. So we can take the title of the document or the who created the document, that kind of idea, and put it in the document itself. That's what the quick part is for. But your BCS columns also become available. So that's really powerful. You create a new proposal, you update the metadata, so you look up a customer, go into your document, it's like a mail merge. You can have all of your columns already filled out with the address of the customer and that sort of thing. Even in the body of the message itself will be completed. Okay, and there's an example of it. So here's a Word document. You can see the quick parts added on here. So when I click this icon here, that's going to display a dialog box in Word with the picker. It's known as the BCS picker, so I can then choose a product or a customer, and it will store it inside my document for me and populate the metadata as well for that document. So pretty powerful. Okay, and we mentioned some of these other ones as well. SharePoint Workspace. It's been deprecated in 2013, so it's still there. You could still use it, but they'd prefer you not to. But it's worth mentioning because it's still useful to take the data offline if you want to. So you can go from an external list and have that data running on your client via the local BDC runtime. Okay, we mentioned some of these other things as well. I was hopefully going to be able to demo these, but that's why they're kind of appearing again. But yeah, we talked about the search, the profile import, and the object model. The object model being the one thing that's really improved here. So building an external content type. This is something that you can do using either SharePoint Designer or Visual Studio, as we mentioned. So if you go into SharePoint Designer, you have the option here of building the external content type. Now you can actually configure a lot via SharePoint Designer for BCS. So in here, under external content types, we'll basically click onto, add connection. That will provide us with another page, and in that page we'll basically configure the connection that we want to create. So that's where it will give us the 3 different types. Unfortunately, it would have been really easy for Microsoft to make OData available in here, or even an Oracle data provider or something like that, but they didn't. They're only giving you SQL or the WCF or the .NET assembly. Okay. So when you add a connection, if you chose Microsoft SQL, it asks you for the name of the database, the name of the server, so we can just key those in. Then it asks you how you want to authenticate. So when you're authenticating, you can choose the Windows authentication, or you can choose the Secure Store. Secure Store obviously has to be pre-configured, and you need to have the Secure Store application name to put into your connection here. That'll then display a tree view where you can expand your tables, your views, all of your routines, and so on. You then right-click each of the tables, whichever one you want to connect to, and you can then go and create the methods for your external content type. So the methods they're named differently in SharePoint Designer to Visual Studio, so it's a bit more friendly in SharePoint Designer. But basically we've got a finder method, and it's called a getList method in SharePoint Designer. So what that's going to do is go and get all of the columns and all of the rows and bring that data back. You've then got lots of other options that you can do on that finder method. You could build multiple finder methods if you want to, and the reason for doing that is so that you can have different views in different circumstances for the same external content type. So in a business data list web part, you might want to show all of the columns and all of the rows, but in the search results, you might not want to. You might want to just show a smaller subset of the columns in there, or apply a different filter to it, that sort of thing. So you can create as many finder methods as you want with different filters and different columns available. You have a specific finder as well. Now, a specific finder basically takes a parameter of the identifier, if that makes sense, so the customer ID or the product ID, whatever's unique, and it passes that through and then returns a single row. This is our probably number one support question is people can't get the external list to work properly, or when they click on a search result, well, the search isn't working basically for that external content type. So it's usually when there's a composite key. So if in the back-end database, let's say you've got your orders table, you've got an order ID, which is unique. If you go to the order details table, say in the Northwind database or AdventureWorks or something like that, you then have a composite key, which is the order ID and the customer ID, something like that. So both of those columns together make it unique. Okay. Herein lies the problem. BCS has to have a single column that contains a unique value. So even if you were to just go and add a new column to the table, you need to do that so that even if it's like an auto number column or something, just every single row has to have a unique value. And then you'll get your search to work. Without it, it won't. Okay? So you have to have that specific finder created. Then you've got the create, update, and delete. So self-explanatory, they allow you to create, update, and delete, which you can do via the external list. And a few of the methods you've got that you can create, one of them is an association. So let's say you've got your customers table and your orders table. If you want to be able to click on a customer and display the orders, you've got to build an association between those two external content types. Okay, so that association is a method that you create here. It's not that straightforward in SharePoint Designer, but also another reason why you can't really work with composite keys, because you need to go from the primary key to a foreign key. And the other one I was going to mention is a custom action. So you can create a custom action, which is really powerful. It's a URL, basically, that takes a parameter of the identifier, any column from the external content type. And it becomes a button inside the external list, inside the web parts, also inside the search results. So let's say we've got a display of all of our customers. If we wanted to perhaps Google those customers or something like that, or Bing the customers. Sounds odd, doesn't it? Bing the customer. Google's got a much better sound to it. Technically, it should be bung. I bung them instead of I binged them. But there we go. So we can hit the drop down on a customer name, click Google or whatever it is, and it will go and open that up in a new window and do a Google search on that company name, that sort of idea. So quite a powerful thing that we can create in there. So that's a custom action. The other thing that we can create here is a ID enumerator. Now the ID enumerator is for the search. So it's actually optional because you can just use the finder method and the specific finder for the search to work, but that's overkill because the finder method is returning every single column, and then we're asking the search index to index every single column when it doesn't need to. All it needs is the identifier. That's it. So you create an ID enumerator column with the identifier, and that will allow you then to index that data. So Visual Studio is the other tool. So you can fire up Visual Studio, and there's in the SharePoint tools there's a external data tool that you can use. Basically, it allows you to build a data diagram inside Visual Studio, so you can create all of your, they call them entities instead of external content types, but you can add all of your entities. So you have a question?
Sorry, yeah, but so if you're using SharePoint Designer, where would this query run? So if you build your query to return your data for your list or whatever,
Yep.
where would that run, that query?
So what happens when we create the external content type is we hit the save icon, which is a floppy disk, in case anybody's like young enough to not know what a floppy disk is. So it's about time they change that, don't you think? So we can hit the save icon, and that writes all of this configuration back to a database called the Managed Metadata Store, which has nothing to do with managed metadata. It's just what they decided to call it. So inside this database, it will contain all of the configuration. So then these methods are called, the finder method, the specific finder, and so on, literally when we click on whatever button calls that operation. So if we go to a site that's got a business data list web part on it, that business data list web part calls the finder method because it has to return all the rows and the columns. If we then went into an external list and we went to edit an item, the first thing happens when we click onto the edit item icon, that's going to call the specific finder, pass through the customer ID of what we clicked on to the dialog box of the specific finder, brings back that data, and then when we change it and hit save, that's calling the edit method, the create method or the updater method. Okay, so it's whatever the queries or the methods are running whenever we perform that operation in SharePoint.
Just think in terms of load, that's potentially quite a lot of data you might be returning that somebody might inadvertently call.
So that's another good question. So there are limits to the amount of data that we can be calling. So the external list has a limit of 2,000 items, which is the preferred limit for an external list. But what you can do is create limit filter methods. So when we're bringing back that data, even if we hit the limit of 2,000, we might get the wrong 2,000, if that makes sense. So we don't want the first 2,000 customers, we want the last 2,000 customers. We don't want to go down our list of customers and only get to customers that begin with E and not show all of the others. So you can create a limit filter that basically specifies the subset of the data that we want to bring back. And that might be customers that have been created this year, for example. So we have a timestamp field or something, or we go by the ID. So we can limit it on the amount of data that we bring about that way. Another place where there's a limit is the item picker. For performance reasons, it only shows us 200 items. So that's where we can use it in InfoPath, in Word, and also in the business data column in the library. So when we go to edit an item, it shows the dialog box. And you'll notice even if you haven't created a filter on your finder method, it'll have a filter dialog box at the top. But it doesn't work unless you've created a filter on your external content type. It doesn't do anything. So let's say we go to look up a customer, you will just see your first 200 customers. So in that case, you need to create a wildcard filter. So this is another reason why you might want to build multiple finder methods. So have one finder method for your business data list web part, another finder method for your picker. Okay, so the picker has a wildcard filter on it that perhaps we don't want to use in the business data list web part. And that would allow us to type in the first few characters of the company name or something like that, and it would then bring back less than the 200, allowing us to look up one of those items. Okay. So yeah, the Excel integration we mentioned was new, so that just shows you a bit of a snapshot of taking the external list data into Excel. The event listeners was the other thing that was new. So you can code against the different events. So any data changing gets fired. Means that you can fire off a workflow. You can also use event receivers in your code now. So if somebody edits an item or changes an item in some way, then that can fire off an event, and also resolves that business data column issue that we described. OData is the last thing that's new. So in Visual Studio, this is where we would connect to an OData source. There's a great website that you can go to, odata.org, if you want to have a play around with this. So if you go to odata.org, there's a link in the top right for ecosystem. Click that. And then on the left, you'll see sample services. If you click that, you've got Northwind, read and write OData sources. So you can bring back products and customers and employees, that sort of thing. So basically, that will give you the URL, and I can talk you through it here. So we go into Visual Studio if we want to use that URL. So basically go into Visual Studio, create a new SharePoint app. It's got to be a SharePoint hosted app. And once you go into that SharePoint hosted app, you can right-click your project, add an item. And instead of when you go to add an item, you normally see all of the different SharePoint items that you can add, like you'll see content type and web part and feature and all of that sort of thing. Don't go as far as that. For some reason, they stuck OData external content types outside of the actual main menu. So just before you get that, you'll see the OData external content type. So you can select it. It will prompt you for the URL. So pop your URL in, and that's it, pretty much. It then goes and creates you your external content type. So you don't write any code for any of this. So it builds the external content type here. You can see this is an example where we've connected to the products URL. It builds us, you can just about see here, products.ect. So that products.ect is my external content type. Okay. What will also be a little bit further down is an external list. So it builds the external list for you and everything. All we have to do then is build it. So we build the project, it deploys the app to SharePoint. We can then click onto that app and you'll see an external list with all of your data that's coming through from your OData data source. And you didn't have to write any code in order to do it. So that's fairly straightforward. The only thing that you might want to change, whenever you build a SharePoint, anybody built an app? SharePoint yet? Okay, so when you build an app, it has a default page that just says hello and then whatever your username is. So you'll have this nice external list and people will click on it. It'll say customer data or something like that. They'll click on the customer data app and it'll say, hello, Brett. You know, okay, this isn't very useful. So what you need to do is go into this elements.xml, and in there it has a start page URL. And all you do is change the start page URL from the default ASPX or whatever it is that it uses to lists / and then the name of your external list, customers or something like that. So that makes it the default page, so then whenever anybody clicks on your app, it's going to go straight to the external list and show them the data. Okay. And this is what it looks like. So once you've deployed your external content type as an app, you can go into SharePoint and you'll see your apps there. So you just basically click onto the app that you want and see the external data. That makes it a lot easier to deploy because remember the different roles. If you're a SharePoint developer and you've developed this external content type, you then have to go and track down your administrator and say, here's my solution that I want you to go and import, please, into SharePoint. And he might take 2 weeks to get around it and go through a change control process and all the rest of it inside your organization before you can then have access to your data. So instead, these are running almost like a sandboxed thing. It's not a sandbox solution, but you know what I mean. So these are protected, and you can basically go and deploy that straight away yourself to a site and access that app and use your data straight away, and cutting out that administrator when you go to deploy it. Okay, so I apologize profusely for you not seeing any demos there, but hopefully you got to gain an understanding of what you get in SharePoint 2013 with business connectivity services. I'll open this up for any questions.